In this section, we're going to talk about automated testing in general. There are three types of automated tests: unit testing, which is what we're going to be dealing with in this course, end-to-end testing, and integration or functional testing. Unit testing and end-to-end testing are fairly well defined. Integration or functional testing tends to be a little bit more of a vague concept that can mean one thing to one person and something different to somebody else. Let's take a look at each of these types of tests. First, we have end-to-end testing. End-to-end testing is the kind of testing that is done against a live running application. This means the full application with a live database, live server, live front end. Then we write tests that exercise that live application. This is generally done through automating the browser. Tests are written to manipulate the browser in an automated way to do things like click buttons, type values into forms, navigate around, and similar tasks. The benefit of end-to-end testing is you can validate that your application works as a whole. There are plenty of drawbacks to end-to-end testing, which have to do with speed and difficulty of writing tests, and generally end-to-end testing tends to be less reliable than other types of automated tests. Next, we go to the other end of the spectrum, which is unit testing. Unit testing is done against a single unit of code. Notice how I put the word unit in quotes. That's because the word unit can mean different things to different people. Generally, the accepted unit of code is a single class, although in some cases you may define a unit as more than a single class. Next, we have everything in between: integration and functional testing. Integration and functional testing is defined as more than a unit but less than the complete application. So it's at least two units working together. Oftentimes, these types of tests are used to check that a certain part of the application works with another part of the application. What is an integration or functional test is somewhat of a vague concept that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Let's look at some diagrams of these concepts. Here we're looking at end-to-end tests. We've got our live application, which includes our front end, our web server, and our database, all working together. With end-to-end tests, we create tests that automate that front end. We write tests that manipulate the browser and exercise our application to prove that it's working. With integration and functional testing, we've zoomed in. In this case, we've gone into our front end, and now we're using two different pieces of our front end that are related and work together, but not necessarily the same unit. In our case, it's our user component and our user service. In an integration or functional test, we might test that those two components work together correctly. To do that, we write integration tests that use the user component, which also uses the live user service, and then we might check and see what kind of HTTP calls the user service is making, or what values it returns back to the user component. Finally, we have unit testing. In this case, we just take a single unit of code, again our user component, and we write tests against that one unit of code. Unit testing is usually the most talked about kind of testing, and generally, in development, we write more unit tests than we write of any other kind of test. Again, there can be a little bit of argument about what is a unit. For example, if we had a user helper class, we might consider that and the user component to be a single unit of code, and we might test those together. Although this course is about unit testing, what we are going to cover will actually bleed a little bit into the integration or functional testing bin that we talked about previously. The reason for this is the nature of how Angular components work. Components in Angular have templates. So Angular has tooling that allows for a special kind of test, which they call an integration test. It uses the template and the component together to make sure that those two pieces are working correctly together. Now again, is this truly an integration test, or is it just another kind of unit test where we have two different pieces that are really just the same unit of code? That's up for you to decide, but the name of this type of testing is officially called integration tests. That is used by the Angular team itself. So we will be calling these integration tests, even though there is some debate as to whether or not this is a traditional unit test.